This is the Patriot. It is heavy, loud, inefficient, and pretty much impractical. Here's a standard 1911 to compare the sound. Alright, so now that we've seen the Patriot actually being fired, I'm just going to kind of go over what it took to make it and where all the details came from. Basically, it took a bunch of taking screenshots from the games of various sources and going from there, doing a bunch of scaling. That's what all the numbers in the bottom are scribbled, and more numbers, some rough concept drawings, eventually taking it into CAD. There were some 3D printed prototypes of the muzzle device and the belt clip, which you can't see here, but basically what it comes down to is getting the right parts throughout the receiver and then custom parts for what kind of makes the Patriot unusual. The main ones being the muzzle device, the gas block, the handguard tube, the belt clip, and the receiver extension or buffer tube, depending on how you call it. So the Patriot itself in-game we see is based on an XM16E1. The XM16E1 was kind of one of the advancements after the M16 itself was first adopted by the Air Force. So what makes it unique, the XM16E1 to the M16, is that the original M16s didn't have the forward assist. That's one of the biggest things that the Air Force, the Colt 604 or the M16, didn't require, but the Army, the XM16E1 and later the M16 A1, required. So that's one thing that immediately tells us it's not an original. So the XM16s in 1964 would have just been coming kind of onto the scene. So given the time span of the game, sure, it's reasonable to think Snake uses an XM16E1 as opposed to a straight-up M16. So it's obviously reasonable that the boss could have had something modified out of that. One thing you'll also notice is this lower receiver just has a straight piece here, whereas the Patriots, which we can clearly see in the cinematic, pretty much every cinematic it is involved in, has what's nicknamed the full fence, so it's both reinforcement and protection for the magazine release button. Another thing that's identified about the fact that it's an XM16 E1 or an M16 A1 versus a newer version of the M16 is the forward assist here. Here you can see it's got what's kind of nicknamed the teardrop shape as opposed to the more modern round shape, which actually came in two variants. Another identifying feature of an XM16E1 is the bolt carrier here. So it's chromed in appearance and has the forward assist serrations. You never actually see this in the cinematic before the boss fight. She never charges it. It's just, okay, time to slap the mag in. Speaking of the magazine, it is a Beta C style drum. These weren't around till the 80s. Typically what you would have seen in 64 would have been 20 round magazines. This one here is a Colt, this one here is an Adventure line. Snake's XM16 typically has these, which would be more correct, but again, the Patriot is kind of mythical in proportions, infinite bullets, or infinite rounds, tumbling bullets. So you kind of have to suspend disbelief there a little bit, just a little bit. Speaking of the tumbling bullets, they don't tumble out of this. It's theoretically possible to do legally. I mean, if you can't do a smoothbore pistol without some extra paperwork, etc. So this is a 7-inch pistol barrel for an AR-15 pistol. That's essentially what this whole thing is. And it's got a 1 in 7 twist. I'm not going to go into twist rates, but essentially bullet stabilization. You could make the bullets tumble out of this if you got one that was 1 in 14, which was the very original prototypes for the M16, or even 1 in 12, which is what they would have been chambered in Vietnam and pretty much up until the A2 came out, and then used a very long, very heavy bullet, and they would destabilize. They wouldn't get fully stabilized, so they would start wobbling in flight. You wouldn't see it at the range that you see it with the Boss. That's just kind of silly to see them coming right out of the barrel tumbling like that. So no, it doesn't do that. I'm glad it doesn't, because that would just be silly and, potentially unsafe. Another big identifying factor is actually the color. So the upper and lower receiver here, you might notice they're not a stark black in comparison to, say, a more modern AR-15. So a more modern AR-15, you're going to have this black color here, very, very deep black. That's kind of the standard now. That's not something you would have seen in Vietnam. They would have all been this couple of different gray shades, sometimes nicknamed XM gray or Colt gray. That's what this color basically is. You'll notice that there is some contrast between the pistol grip, the receiver extension, and the handguard. These two which are anodized. This is just a plastic. This is actually from the period. Some of the stuff is. The mag release is, the firing pins are, the pivot pins are, but some of the rest of it is reproduction, because I wasn't going to source authentic parts for something that's completely unauthentic, unlike the Colt 604 reproduction you saw. So, other parts that would be correct for this era, we've already talked about the forward assist. Obviously the receiver is a huge thing. That's actually one thing I should have mentioned is modern receivers, you'll see they have this bump here that serves as a shell deflector. You didn't see that until the A2. And then some of the Canadian receivers, they were an A1 style upper with that bump added. The difference there being the sights. So the Selector here is completely smooth. There's no little tick to indicate safer fire because there's no markings on this side of the receiver for safer fire. That's all on the other side. So that would be one thing that you would also want to look for in terms of details. The port door here has a small rectangle. More modern ones, they have a larger kind of trapezoid shape here. So that kind of identifies which era you're looking at in terms of port doors. The trigger guard, again, it would be that gray color as opposed to the stark black, or the other rifle I've been showing actually has a mag pull one, so obviously that wouldn't be correct. So that's kind of the base gun when you're just looking between, at the receiver group itself. One of the biggest things that's a lot of other Patriot kind of attempts have done is the upper and lower receivers have been wrong. So this might look pretty similar to the other one that I've been showing, but this is an A1 receiver, so other than just color, there's differences in the profile, reinforcements in the rear section and in the front section. That's a smaller thing, but it's pretty noticeable. You'll also typically find the more modern receivers only in that dark black. These two receivers come from a company called Nodak Spud. They specialize in retro reproduction receivers right down to the correct color. And they have a lot more than just the A1s. This is their A1 set, so this is an A1 profile lower and A1 profile upper. They also have pre-A1 stuff right down to the original design, which actually had the charging handle right here as a trigger shape. Really cool stuff. You should check them out if you have any interest in kind of retro AR-15 components. So with the kind of the base out of the way, again, basically just putting together an M16 A1 receiver set with the correct components. Then we're going to move out from the center here to the essentially everything that's custom. So the muzzle brake here is pretty iconic for the series. It also is what helps this thing be very loud, have a huge concussion, and shoot fireballs. This, just like pretty much all the custom parts, was started, okay, let's take a bunch of screenshots, measure based on a known size. So typically the width of this part of the receiver, this part of the receiver, the length of a certain portion of the receiver, and then taking that, so we know, say this is X units long, and then in that same shot this is Y units in diameter, and going from there. So the muzzle device was something that started with a 3D printed prototype. Here's one of them. Pretty basic, but the main thing was getting this port to look right. In the game, it's pretty much square. There are some other kind of off-the-shelf options that are close. They're either a bit shorter, a bit longer. So again, you can get close with off-the-shelf stuff, but if I wanted to go close, I wouldn't have done all of this. Where's the fun in that? So it is turned and milled out of steel, given a parkerized finish, which would have been correct for the time, and it's still correct for a lot of stuff. The gas block itself, that was again scaled, and then the depth for how far into the handguards it goes, that really wasn't scaled. That was just done, okay, how far does it, if it sticks this far out in the screenshots, we'll start it there and then kind of work backwards to where does it meet the gas port on the barrel itself. So it was kind of how far out does it stick? Okay, now how much longer do I have to make? That is milled out of steel, and there aren't any relief cuts in it. If I were to do another one of these, I would definitely add some relief cuts to it, because it is basically a solid block of steel, and it adds a lot of weight to it. The gas block itself, I think, is just over a pound. The handguard is turned out of aluminum and then black anodized. One thing that's kind of interesting is, depending on which game you see the Patriot in, the handguard changes. So in the cinematics in the original game, in Metal Gear Solid 3, when we first see it, compared to Peace Walker and Metal Gear Solid 4 when we see it again, the grooves change. In Metal Gear Solid 3, you really don't see any grooves. It's pretty smooth up till here where you've got kind of a knurling. In Peace Walker and 4, you have 8 distinct grooves. So I kind of went in between. You can see there are grooves here. There are 8 grooves, and I did match the depth, which probably could have gone a little bit deeper. But there's no knurling back here, and the reason for that is the barrel nut. To try and do a custom barrel nut would have been one of the most difficult things. A lot of machining there compared to the other parts. So this is actually a barrel nut from kind of a host, a tiny little pistol tube that's only about this long. So it's kind of a host there, and then we made a custom tube to match it. So that's why there's no knurling here. And then the grooves, I'm going to be honest, even if there was knurling here, I still would have wanted to put grooves, because, again, this is a real firearm. The last thing you want is your hand slipping off this and going anywhere near here. If it's not in front of the muzzle and in danger of getting shot, high-pressure hot gases coming out of the muzzle device is not where you really want your hand to be in the way of. So, yeah, there needed to be some grooves. Even if it wasn't correct, there would have had to have been something, since this is real, and safety kind of needs to come first. So the other thing, though, that is custom is the belt clip. So the belt clip here is comes out from the receiver. The measured amount is the length to go around a standard pistol belt, correct for the era. I don't have my stable harness here to show you, but actually, even if I did, I couldn't fit it. There's no place where you could fit this on Snake's stable harness with his holster there. The boss obviously can, because she really doesn't have too much else. But so this also incorporates the receiver end plate. So you can see this comes down as one piece, and then there's a little bit of a boss there that sticks into the receiver and prevents it from rotating. You would typically have that with a collapsible stock as well. So that carries over onto a pistol tube, If it were solid stock, the stock itself would actually fit into that portion. So these are the other custom parts back here. This is steel, just bent, and then the boss welded on. And then this is aluminum, was slightly modified from its original configuration, and then anodized afterwards to make it look all pretty. While we're up here, the rear sight, there are some cinematics you don't see it, but it's very, very clearly seen in others, especially right before the scene where Snake kills the boss. You actually see from her perspective looking straight up, and the sights are very clearly there. That basically covers the custom parts pretty well. One thing to note, as I did mention during the range video, this is horribly impractical and incredibly heavy. Something else I'd like to go over is when people say that the Patriot is just an M231 firing port weapon. The M231 firing port weapon, as the name suggests, was designed to be mounted into the firing ports of an APC and used as extra defense against personnel. The general design is kind of reminiscent of an M231, especially the smooth tube back here, but one of the big things is the M231, the whole project for it didn't start until 72. The AR pattern one, which became the XM231, didn't kind of get classified until 74, and the whole project wasn't done until 79. And then the Bradley itself wasn't done until around that time anyways, much later than the 64 that Snake Eater takes place in. The tube does, as I mentioned, kind of have that similar look, but a firing port weapons tube actually is much shorter and looks like this. The step here is actually from the XM231, because originally they had given it a little stock so it could be used dismounted in an emergency. When they finished the design, they actually got rid of that because they really didn't want it being used dismounted. But you can see this block actually replaces that receiver end plate. And to make things more complicated, the Pachinko remaster that we will never get as a beautiful remaster of Snake Eater, thanks Konami, has this block here and a different stock just to make things more complicated. So the other part about the firing port weapon is the entire front end is very different. It's got a longer gas system, different handguards, and the gas block is actually very special because it has those coarse threads to be able to kind of twist, lock in, and mount onto the weapon itself. Or not the vehicle itself. The other thing is the Selector. So the firing port weapon Selector, on the Selector side, is very custom plate because it fires from what's called an open bolt, whereas a standard AR fires from a closed bolt, and that's not something I'm going to get into. But it would be very noticeable. So it's got a modified kind of selector area right down in here. It's a big plate, and then the selector positions are different. So what tells us it's not a firing port weapon, other than, again, date, difference of tube, difference of front end, in the cinematics you actually see that side of the receiver, and it's got the more standard positions here as opposed to that big plate. So that's how you can tell that it's not receiver-wise based on the firing port weapon. So that's pretty much it. From the beginning videos, I do have some more footage that was taken at different angles, but I was by myself at the range using a camera on a tripod. No one to help me kind of figure out, okay, you're in the right position, so my head's kind of cut off, and in some cases the most of the pistol is cut off as well. If you're noticing, I didn't have a lot. There was a lot of the small details I didn't have on in the costume. The biggest detail, I'm sure, was the eye patch and the face paint. The eye patch because kind of need to aim. I'm not Snake. I don't have super senses being able to aim without an eye. So again, that kind of comes back to the safety and being able to aim. The face paint because I was already in full costume. I didn't need face paint. Didn't want to look any stranger, but obviously some of the particulars, the knee parts, the survival knife, etc. I'd taken off the Vox box earlier because I had actually just done a rifle course with that gear, and I didn't want it getting damaged. But yeah, so that was plenty of fun going to the range and then changing into a costume there and doing some video. So I will have that footage right after this. But yeah, after a bit over a year of planning, wait time for the receivers, USPS losing a barrel, and then having to go through a couple others that were all about half an inch longer before finally being able to get a new 7-inch one. It's been fun. It's been frustrating, but the result is really fun, really loud, huge concussions, and shoots fireballs. And of course you can mentally hum Snake Eater in your head the entire time. So that's it. This is my Patriot, and I hope you enjoyed the video.
What a thrill, with darkness and silence in the mind. What a thrill, I'm searching and I'm melting to you. What a fear in my heart, but you're so supreme.